pendientes al chat por cualquier problema técnico que a veces ustedes nos informan que se escucha muy bajito o hay algún problema, lo solucionamos rápidamente. Voy a poner en el chat las instrucciones prontamente para poder hacer este cambio en la traducción. Los invitamos a participar en esta actividad realizando sus preguntas a lo largo de ella en la sección de preguntas y respuestas que tiene la sigla Q&A, que es preguntas y respuestas, Q y A, que está en la barra inferior de Zoom. Les pedimos que el chat lo usen solo en caso de problemas técnicos y todas las preguntas de los expositores las pueden hacer en esta sección de preguntas y respuestas, porque también ahí los expositores, cuando no contestan todas las preguntas, pueden contestar de manera escrita alguna de sus preguntas. En esta oportunidad, además, tenemos una variante respecto a los encuentros anteriores. Tenemos 5 minutos de preguntas al final de cada expositor y luego los 20 minutos tradicionales de discusión grupal como lo hemos hecho anteriormente. Así que es muy importante que vayan anotando sus preguntas en la sección de preguntas y respuestas del Zoom. Les comento que esta actividad está siendo transmitida a través del canal de streaming de nuestra universidad, uddtv.udd.cl, y también que esta presentación va a estar prontamente, el video y los PowerPoint, disponibles en nuestro sitio web, educacionsuperior.udd.cl. Esperamos que hoy la tecnología y las conexiones nos acompañen, pero les pedimos consideración si que tuviésemos algún tipo de problema técnico durante la charla, que nunca hemos tenido, pero esperamos que nos entiendan si ocurriese. Agradecemos a los interesados en participar en este panel y los invitamos a informarse sobre nuestras actividades en la web de psicología.udd.cl y en nuestras redes sociales @psicologiaudd. Bien, entonces estamos prontos a comenzar. El día de hoy, martes 15 de noviembre, comenzamos en horas de la tarde para Chile el panel 2 titulado Generando retroalimentación desde los docentes y los pares. Inicia su ponencia la doctora Naomi Winston con su presentación titulada Literacidad de la retroalimentación desde la teoría a la práctica. La doctora Naomi Winston completó su formación en psicología en la Universidad de Surrey en el año 2005, que incluye un año de formación profesional en psicología educativa con el Servicio de Psicología Educativa del Condado de Dorset. Luego completó una maestría de Psicología del Desarrollo Temprano en la Universidad de Reading en el año 2006, antes de regresar a Surrey para realizar un doctorado. Es profesora de Psicología, de Educación y directora del Instituto de Educación de la Universidad de Surrey y además dirige el Laboratorio Multidisciplinario de Evaluación y Aprendizaje. La investigación de Naomi ha llevado al desarrollo de herramientas y recursos educativos como el kit de herramientas Developing Engagement with Feedback, publicado por Advanced Higher Education, que está en uso en más de 150 escuelas, colegios y universidades de todo el mundo. También desarrolló el sistema de participación y seguimiento de retroalimentación, que recibió el premio a la Iniciativa de Desarrollo Educativo del año de SEDA en 2018. Naomi es miembro de la Academia de Educación Superior y miembro nacional de enseñanza del Reino Unido. Naomi, te doy la más cordial bienvenida. ¿Puedes encender tu cámara? Bien. Y puedes comenzar, la audiencia es tuya.
Well, good evening from the UK, and thank you, Veronica, for the invitation to join this panel this evening. And I'm really looking forward to our discussions around the generation of feedback from teachers and peers. So I'm going to start by talking about a concept, a topic that has become a really key area of research within assessment and feedback in higher education. But I want to think about this from a practice perspective in how we take the conceptual work, the empirical work that's been done around this topic of feedback literacy, and then think about how we actually apply that in classrooms. What some of the barriers might be to implementing these concepts within classrooms and how we can overcome some of those barriers. So I'm going to start by looking back to the development of work around feedback literacy and some of the key trends that we're seeing in the literature at the moment. And I'm going to do that then by looking at why feedback literacy has been seen as such an important topic within the literature and within practice, and then looking at how we can develop students' feedback literacy within real classroom contexts. I then want us to think about how we can move beyond approaches to feedback literacy that treat students from all disciplines as the same, and instead how we can develop feedback literacies in ways that actually mean something within the discipline where students are working. And then finally, thinking about the contextual barriers to the implementation of feedback literacy and how we can overcome them. And then I'll end by offering a few thoughts about where I see the future of research in this area travelling over the coming years. So the concept of feedback literacy is not new, and the ideas underpinning the concept of feedback literacy have been discussed in the literature for many years, and we can trace them back to many of the key articles that influence our own thinking for many of us working in assessment and feedback. Whether that's the work of Roy Sadler, David Nichol, Margaret Price, and some of David Carlis's early work, we can see ideas that feedback needs to be more than just something that teachers do, that dialogue is important, that student engagement is important. And I think these are the kinds of ideas that really paved the way for the thinking about feedback literacy. Maybe not necessarily in the way those original authors might have seen their work having an influence on current thinking, but certainly these ideas are not new. But the term itself was really seen by us in the literature in 2012 through a publication by Paul Sutton, where he used an academic literacies perspective to conceptualize feedback literacy as relating to students knowing, being, and acting. So by knowing, he meant students being aware of the influence of feedback on their understanding. By being, students' awareness of the influence of feedback on their identity, their sense of self. And acting, students' awareness of the importance of being active within feedback processes and taking action on feedback comments. This idea of student action is something that was very influential for me in the work that I have been doing in this area. And although we didn't use the term feedback literacy because we were coming from a psychological perspective, we did publish a paper in 2017 which did look at the capacities and skills that are needed for the use of feedback, which is very similar to some of the later ideas around feedback literacy. But we called these recipients skills, and I will return to talking about these recipient skills later on. We then have the paper that really kick-started the explosion of research into the topic of feedback literacy, published by David Carlis and David Bowd in 2018. And they proposed a framework for student feedback literacy, representing the skills and the capacities that they believed were important for students to be able to demonstrate if they're going to be able to make effective use of feedback. So they talked about the importance of students appreciating feedback, what it is, where it comes from, all of the different forms of feedback. And in the second talk in this panel, Marion will be expanding on some of those ideas about where feedback comes in classroom talk, not just within formal assessment situations. Carlis and Bowd also talked about the importance of students being able to make judgments as part of feedback literacy, to know what good work looks like and to be able to apply quality standards and criteria to their own work or the work of others. Managing affect, so being able to deal productively with emotional responses to feedback. And then they argued that all three of those areas of capacity would feed into the ability to take action upon feedback. One more paper that I think it's worth pointing out at this point was a more empirically derived framework for student feedback literacy by Elizabeth Malloy, David Bowd and Michael Henderson. And this was based on a large study, data collected from Australian university students, very large samples. And they looked back at students' perceptions of feedback to be able to draw together an empirically derived framework. It's contains a lot more components than the Carless and Bowd framework, but you can still map some of them back. But it's certainly more comprehensive and driven by empirical evidence. Now, since 2019, the publication of Elizabeth Malloy's paper, we've seen a real explosion of research and people applying different lenses to the conceptualization and study of feedback literacy. Constructivist approaches, cognitive approaches, ecological, even socio-material conceptualizations of feedback literacy, or literacies, if we're thinking about this as more of a situated concept. We've also seen an explosion in the publication of measures for feedback literacy, validated scales, a lot more still coming out for different contexts, with the indication then that perhaps researchers are thinking this is something that's valuable to measure. And we're also seeing lots of papers representing case studies for feedback literacy within different disciplines. So it's probably what we might call a hot topic within higher education research at present. So I want to start by thinking about why this topic is important. The interest in research, the number of citations, the number of views of some of these papers suggests that both researchers and practitioners are feeling there's something quite important about this concept. So why should we care about feedback literacy? The first reason is a very practical one. We are continuously being evaluated in educational contexts, in our professional lives, and even in our personal lives. And whilst we may understand that feedback is absolutely central to our improvement, it's also quite challenging to understand feedback, to accept feedback sometimes, and to be able to use that feedback to inform future improvement. So it's a very ubiquitous part of our lives. The second reason why I think this matters, and this comes from my background as a psychologist and looking at this issue from a psychological perspective, is that as humans, we are remarkably consistent in our behaviour in response to feedback information. No matter how well we know that feedback is valuable, and no matter how skilled we are in being able to put feedback into practice, our basic biases and motivations can sometimes override that very sensible response to feedback, instead to make us behave in different ways. And we often find it difficult to hear difficult information, unpleasant information, critique of ourselves. And we'd much rather hear positive things, people saying nice things about us. And evidence for this comes from a lot of studies showing that we're more likely to seek feedback from people that we think will be positive about us. And we're more likely to seek feedback on skills or areas where we think we excel. So we are biased to seek out the comforting, nice, positive feedback information. Some people are very good at seeking out and wanting to hear the more difficult critical information, but generally we're predisposed to want to hear positive information rather than critique. And a few years ago, we wrote a piece for BBC Future about what we can learn from the psychological literature about people's defensive reactions to feedback. And in this, we uncovered some really interesting studies that demonstrate some of the ways in which we protect ourselves from criticism. And these kinds of things that we might do are sometimes unconscious. We may not even know that we are being defensive in response to feedback, because we have developed quite subtle ways of being able to protect our fragile self-esteem in the face of criticism. And it's important to note that these defensive reactions are not student problems, but they're human problems. And I often hear a lot of negativity about students and their responses to feedback, that they're not resilient enough to deal with critique, or they don't care about feedback. And I think this is quite a dangerous approach, because it's nothing that students are necessarily doing wrong. Some of these are very fundamental human responses to being faced with criticism. So understanding feedback literacy and how we can make use of feedback, even when we find it very, very difficult, is important. The final reason why I'm going to argue it's important to understand feedback literacy comes from a piece of research that we did where we collected questionnaire data from a large sample of students from the UK. And we asked them to self-report their general levels of engagement with feedback, use of feedback. And we also asked them to complete several validated scales, measuring things like their personality traits, the big 5 personality traits, their achievement goal orientation, for example, whether they were pursuing mastery goals to improve relative to their own competence and performance, or performance goals, where they were looking to improve relative to others. And we also measured their beliefs in feedback using a measure called the feedback orientation scale, which gives us an indication of their belief in the utility of feedback and their sense of self-efficacy, or their sense of confidence in being able to use feedback effectively. Now, what we found is that some of those individual difference factors, like having a strong mastery goal orientation or being very high in the personality trait of conscientiousness, not surprisingly, related positively to greater use of feedback. We might expect that students who are striving to develop themselves and improve their understanding for their own benefit would make better use of feedback. And we might expect that students who are more conscientious would make better use of feedback. But we found that that relationship was mediated by their beliefs in feedback. So their volition, their willingness to do the hard work to implement feedback, their belief in the utility of feedback, believing that actually engaging with feedback is going to have some kind of impact. And then their self-efficacy, their confidence in their skills to use feedback effectively, if you like, their feedback literacy. So that suggests, for example, that one of the reasons why students who are high in conscientiousness make greater use of feedback is because they feel more confident in being able to do so. We also saw a relationship, not a direct relationship between neuroticism and use of feedback, but an indirect relationship that was mediated by self-efficacy to use feedback. So students who are higher in the personality trait of neuroticism, characterized by anxiety in popular terminology, they felt less confident in their ability to use feedback effectively. And that meant that they were less likely to use feedback. So what this paper encouraged us to put forward as an argument is that building students' confidence in being able to use feedback, being able to develop skills and capacities that help them to do that, is quite an important thing for us to focus on within education. So the second question then, what does it mean to develop students' feedback literacy? And we hear a lot about this in research papers, and I'm starting to see it in university policies saying that it's an important activity for lecturers to be involved in the development of students' feedback literacy. But what does that actually mean, and how can teachers achieve this? So to give one set of ideas, I'm going to return to our systematic review paper that I mentioned earlier on. And in this article, we reviewed the literature on students' engagement with feedback to be able to summarise the factors that influence the extent to which students are able to engage with feedback. But we also reviewed the different interventions and practices that are reported in the literature with the aim of enabling students to get the most out of feedback processes. And in doing that, we were able to draw out the key skills that underpin the effective use of feedback. And we categorise these into 4 groups. And these, as we argued, are the key skills that an individual needs if they are going to be able to engage productively in feedback processes. The first is self-appraisal, and this is important both for an individual being able to understand their strengths and weaknesses and to think about how feedback can help them to improve and develop. But it also links to some of the more recent work that's been characterising probably a key trend, I think, another key trend in higher education literature at the moment, which is the idea of inner feedback, and inner feedback being generated by making comparisons. And David Nichol has written some very influential articles on the idea of inner feedback. And that is a crucial skill, not only in using feedback, but being able to generate feedback in the first place, to be able to compare your own work against an exemplar, something a peer has produced, against feedback that's coming from an external source, and to be able to generate feedback for yourself. Assessment literacy is the second key skill, the capacity to know what good work looks like, to be able to understand criteria and standards, take the perspective of a marker and know what good work looks like. Because if you don't know what good work looks like, it's very difficult for you to be able to use feedback to help you get there. The third key recipient skill is goal setting and self-regulation, and this represents the capacity to know what you want to achieve by using feedback and monitor your progress towards achieving those aims. And sometimes we might set out with a particular strategy when applying feedback and then find that that's not working and we have to go back and try something different. And that self-regulation, self-monitoring is really important if we're going to use feedback effectively. And the final skill we uncovered from our literature review is engagement and motivation, recognizing that actually to be able to use feedback effectively, you need to be willing to put in what is quite hard work to make that feedback impactful. Now, in our review, as I mentioned, we looked at all of the different interventions that were reported in the literature to support students' engagement with feedback. And in the paper, we map them against those 4 key recipient skills, looking at if you wanted to develop self-regulation and goal setting, for example, what kinds of evidence there is out there for things that might help that. But we also looked here at different clusters, different types of interventions, things that can be done within the curriculum to help develop students' use of feedback. So, for example, in the top left there, you see a cluster of interventions that are all aiming to develop students' assessment literacy. There are also interventions in the top right, which we call collective provision of training, the kinds of things you could do with large groups of students at the same time, such as running a feedback workshop. Manner of feedback delivery, this represented the kinds of interventions that changed in some way the way in which feedback was provided or delivered to students, such as using audio or video feedback. And then sustainable monitoring represented interventions that supported students to be able to set targets, to keep track of their progress and their development through the use of feedback. Now, having conducted this study, we then did some work with students to try and get their perceptions of some of these interventions and what they thought might be particularly useful. And there were 2 things that came out from those conversations with students. The first was they saw real value to feedback workshops or opportunities for them to learn how to use feedback effectively as part of their course of study, and being able to practice using feedback and to talk about what that actually meant. They were saying to us that they keep getting told that they need to use their feedback, but no one's told them how or what that might involve. The second one that they thought would be particularly useful was a feedback portfolio. So the opportunity for them to collate all of their feedback in one place to look for common trends or patterns in comments across different assignments from different tutors, and be able to use that synthesis to inform what steps they wanted to take next. So that then informed for us the development of a resource to directly support students' use of feedback. And so in 2016, we published the Developing Engagement with Feedback Toolkit, which has 3 components. A feedback guide, which was a short guide written by students for other students, containing tips and advice for how to use feedback and sharing some of the challenges that different students had experienced. We then developed a set of activities and resources to be able to build a feedback workshop, some kind of dedicated time to work with students to practice and develop these skills, and the building blocks for a feedback portfolio to support students to be able to collate feedback, spot patterns and trends, and set action points. And since the publication of the toolkit, we have also developed that portfolio into an e-portfolio that enables students to tag their feedback against different academic skills and therefore track their progress over time. The toolkit is freely available to download, and everything can be downloaded as Word files, so it can be easily translated and used in different contexts. Another example of how this idea of feedback literacy can be developed in real classrooms comes from a study by Bianca Mileka, who did her PhD with David Bowd, and they worked with David Carlos on a conceptual paper which looked at lots of different ideas for how teachers could use quite simple activities, things that might already be done as part of classroom sessions or part of assessment practices, but that would support the development of student feedback literacy as conceptualized within David Bowd and David Carlos's model. So the first thing they talked about is the potential of interactive cover sheets to support the development of student feedback literacy. And interactive cover sheets are quite a simple way of bringing some form of dialogue into feedback processes, but also encouraging students to start the feedback conversation. And the idea with an interactive cover sheet is that when students submit work for assessment, they're encouraged to reflect upon how they've used feedback from previous work to inform the work they are submitting at that point in time, but also to request the marker to focus on 2 or 3 particular elements of their work when they are providing feedback. And there are several studies on the effectiveness of interactive cover sheets. One of the key challenges with the use of interactive cover sheets is that not all students complete them. It tends to be the more engaged students who will take advantage of that opportunity, whereas there's a need to really embed that into the normal practice so that all students engage. Self-assessment is the second area they talk about, so opportunities for students to look critically at their own work and start to develop those capacities for making judgments. And it's very difficult to develop the sophisticated judgments that are necessary to support development as a learner without the opportunity to practice and hone those over time. Peer review and rebuttal is another area that they talk about, and the benefits of peer assessment are well documented, where the benefits for the peer providing feedback are perhaps more impactful than the benefits the student receiving the feedback, because you have to take that perspective of a marker. And it also opens up that potential for making comparisons between your own work and the work of the peer that you're looking at to generate that inner feedback that David Nichol talks about. But in this paper, they argue that peer feedback, peer review by itself is not enough. What's really important in developing feedback literacy is that the peer receiving the feedback then has to respond to the person who's given them their feedback, to respond in a way that outlines what they've understood from the feedback and what they're going to do and how they're going to take that forward. So it's encouraging that action and critical reflection upon the feedback rather than merely receiving the information. And finally, they talk about feedback portfolios, a bit like the one that we developed, as a really useful way of encouraging ongoing curation of feedback and thinking about feedback as not a single event, but something that's much more complex and that takes place over many, many years and builds skills and understanding through that synthesis. So 2 quite different examples. One involves sort of additional activities like the workshops within the Developing Engagement with Feedback Toolkit. And this second example is much more about embedding these activities within the normal parts of the course, assessment and learning and teaching activities. So I'm going to move on now to think about the disciplinary specific approaches to feedback literacy. Both of the examples I've just shared are quite general in their application, with the idea that students, no matter what program they were studying, could participate or use these kinds of approaches. But I've become increasingly interested in thinking about this in a more nuanced way and looking at not just feedback literacy, but feedback literacies, representing the different kinds of approaches and skills that are needed within different disciplinary contexts. And my interest in this developed from a case study that we wrote about in the book that David Carless and I wrote on feedback. And we collected various case studies as part of the book. And one of them was, I thought, a really neat design. And this was a large first-year psychology unit taught by a lecturer at a university in the UK. And each week over the course of this module, he would teach students the main theories of social psychology, different approaches, so that by the end of it, students had a thorough grounding in the discipline of social psychology. But what he did was reserve the last 10 minutes of every lecture to link the particular theory or approach that had been discussed in that week's lecture to the topic of feedback. So understanding, for example, how attitudes to different groups of people might influence people's perceptions of the credibility of the feedback giver. So he would use research that had a social psychological perspective, but that told us something about how people typically respond to feedback. He then gave them a feedback workshop halfway through the program to develop and practice their skills of using feedback. And then his assessment was really clever. So he asked students to write an essay outlining and explaining their own responses to feedback that they had shown in the past, but using the theories of social psychology that they'd been learning about to interpret their behaviour and to try and understand why they behaved the way they had. So what was important to me about this example was that it enabled students to develop their understanding of feedback, to have conversations about the importance of feedback and how to use it effectively, not as a separate session, but as something that was fundamentally linked to the content of the programme, the disciplinary content that they were learning about. And this inspired me to think about how this might be done in different disciplines, not just within psychology. So together with Kieran Ballou and David Carless, we did quite a large project where we analysed the Quality Assurance Agency's subject benchmark statements. So in the UK, these are documents that set out some of the key things that a particular discipline will cover on a programme and the key skills and attributes that a student of that discipline will be able to demonstrate by the end of the programme. So they're the closest things that we have to a national level syllabus for higher education, but they're quite flexible and people can interpret them in different ways. But we use these as the data source to try and look at how people could embed this idea of developing students' feedback literacy within the context of the curriculum. And we came up with 5 areas where we thought this would be possible that cut across different disciplines. And I'll just briefly talk through some of these. So the first was the use of activities or things that students might do to learn how to respond to a task brief or something that a client had requested. So this was common in the design-based disciplines. Architecture is a really good example. Whereas part of their learning and development as an architect, students had to learn to use feedback in quite particular ways, to listen to what a client was asking for, to put forward a design, to receive quite public feedback on that design, and then hone that further in response to the feedback. So this opens up the opportunity for students to understand the importance of using feedback in an academic context by looking at those skills that they're developing in their professional practice to be able to use feedback effectively. The second area there, reflection on an evaluation of professional practice. So there are a lot of disciplines, particularly in healthcare and education, where it was a requirement of programmes for students to be able to reflect upon what they were doing in their practice, to evaluate their practice. And this is a really good opportunity then to talk about some of those key feedback literacy skills, such as self-appraisal. and goal setting that is important within the professional practice, but is also relevant in education too. Promoting behaviour change. So there were a cluster of disciplines within our study where students learned about theories of behaviour change. Dietetics is a really good example, where students might be learning about how to work with a client to, let's say, change their eating behaviour. Now, if that patient, that client, doesn't listen to the feedback of the dietitian, they're not going to see the changes that are needed to their health as a result of changing their eating behaviour. So there's a really nice analogy there between the theories of behaviour change that students are learning about within the professional context, and also the importance of using feedback and not leaving feedback unused within education. The mechanisms of learning, helping others learn and develop. Many disciplines, for example, education, psychology, where students learn about how feedback works in the brain, how feedback works in supporting pupils' learning. So again, a nice curriculum space to be able to talk about feedback and its impacts. And finally, cognate concepts. So there were many disciplines where the concept of feedback itself takes on a particular meaning in that discipline. Engineering is a really clear example where the context of feedback means closing a system where the output feeds back in to change something within that system. And there's a really nice opportunity to talk about feedback. So this is a way of thinking about feedback literacies, not in general, but in terms of the particular focus on the discipline, thinking about what students will go on to do in their professional lives, how feedback will work for them in that context. And again, I think this can link back to some of the key areas of interest within the literature at the moment, where perhaps the capacity to make judgments of quality, for example, is a really important hallmark of some disciplines. And so developing that is important in supporting students. Or even inner feedback from David Nichols' work, that the capacity to make those comparisons and generate inner feedback takes on a particular meaning in some professional areas. So that then becomes a discipline-specific feedback literacy rather than a generic one. So I want to end by thinking about some of the barriers to the implementation of feedback literacy, why this might be difficult to do, and what some of the enablers might be to make this more achievable for individual educators, teams of educators, and educational institutions. So the first set of challenges come from Elizabeth Malloy, David Bowd and Michael Henderson's paper, The Empirically Derived Framework for Feedback Literacy. And in the discussion section of their article, they talk about two particular challenges. The first is that for some educators, it's quite difficult to shift their perspective from being the provider, the sole source of feedback, towards a facilitator of to be able to yield some of the responsibility to students and not feel that as educators we have to tell them everything through feedback, but rather we want to support students to be able to generate that feedback for themselves and to use that feedback effectively. So there's a mind shift that's needed there to be able to see our roles as educators in a different way. The other challenge that they talk about is appropriately embedding feedback literacy within higher education curricula. And some of the things they talk about there is perhaps the worry that if a teacher spends too much time supporting the development of feedback literacy, they're not going to be able to cover all of the content of the programme. And that's where I think the discipline-specific feedback literacies approach can help overcome that particular barrier. But there's also the challenge of, do educators know how to support students to develop these skills, and how do we enable them to develop the confidence in being able to share then is a set of characteristics of feedback literacies at the system level. So we can talk about individual students having feedback literacy. We can talk about teachers having feedback literacy. But we shouldn't see this as an individual capacity and put all of the responsibility on an individual, whether that's a student or a teacher, to have or possess this thing called feedback literacy, because the context and the environment and the system will enable or constrain the development of those capacities. So in this piece, Ed Pitt and I argue for the importance of systemic feedback literacies, of effective environments and cultures that support the approach to feedback that looks at responsibility sharing, that looks at the generation of inner feedback, that sees feedback as something that is just as much generated by students as it is by peers and by teachers. And so we talk about some of the things that enable that to happen. Positioning feedback processes in policy and practice as being central to student learning. Policy and practice are intertwined. Policy documents, guidelines, codes of practice drive behaviour. And so that needs to be supportive of these kinds of approaches to feedback. Enabling students to engage in dialogue with educators to construct shared understandings of feedback within the context of their own disciplines. And that's a really important part of the cultural environment that facilitates effective feedback processes. An environment where the effectiveness of feedback is seen as a shared responsibility between students and teachers, not just something that teachers have responsibility for. Understanding as a system that teachers can only do so much, but the real impact of feedback comes from what students do. Full recognition of the time and emotional work that goes into feedback, rather than saying that an educator has 15 minutes per essay to provide feedback. That commodifies feedback away from something that is actually quite complex. It's quite emotive as work, and greater flexibility is needed there. Evaluating feedback processes through a much wider evidence base than just student evaluations, being able to look for the impact of feedback and effectiveness in terms of what students do with the information rather than just how satisfied they are with it. And finally, time. There's no way that these approaches to feedback can be effective if educators do not have time and space to engage with scholarship, to talk to their colleagues, to talk to their students, to discuss feedback and how it can be enacted differently. So I'm going to summarise by looking to the horizon to think about what feedback literacy research practice might look like in the future. One of the key trends that I see is a shift towards measurable outcomes. So there's a real need to look at what impact feedback has beyond just satisfaction. What impact does it have on behaviour? What impact does it have on motivation, confidence, for example? In terms of practice, I see a key trend as embedding feedback literacy into programs, but also in a sustained way, not just a one-off intervention or a one-off approach, but something that is woven into a degree program from beginning to end. And even beyond, how does the activities that we engage with students in feedback in higher education influence their transition to the workplace and supporting their future employability? And finally, how can we evidence student feedback literacy? Yes, measurement through scales, through questionnaires, but what's the role, for example, of reflective journals or learning logs in giving us a window into student feedback literacy? So I will stop there. Very happy. I think we've got 5 minutes to answer some questions now, but I look forward to further discussion later on in the panel.
Muchas gracias, Naomi. Muy interesante presentación, muy además bien organizada, como que iban apareciendo preguntas, pero a medida que ibas avanzando, sigan solucionando solas. Pero aquí tenemos varias inquietudes de algunos participantes. Tengo acá a la doctora Galia Meneses Riquelme, y ella dice, ¿cuáles serían, según tu experiencia, las competencias o capacidades fundamentales que los profesores universitarios deberían contar para favorecer la literacidad de la retroalimentación?
Yeah, thank you. So one of the things that I didn't cover today was an article that David Carlos and I wrote on teacher feedback literacy, and thinking about what a teacher can do to support students' use of feedback and the development of their feedback literacy. And then we talked about feedback design. So the role of teachers in designing feedback processes in ways that empower students to use feedback. So giving them follow-up tasks, for example, where they have somewhere to use that information. To understand the relational dimensions of feedback. So being sensitive to the impact of feedback on our students, but also managing practicalities. And we're often faced with challenges, aren't we, to decide how we invest our time within these kinds of activities. And so thinking about how best we manage that is also important. Just as David Carlos and David Bowd's conceptual framework for student feedback literacy was followed by an empirically derived framework for student feedback literacy from Elizabeth Malloy and colleagues, the conceptual framework for teacher feedback literacy that David Carlos and I presented has been followed up by an empirically derived one from David Bowd and Phil Dawson, which has been recently published in Assessment and Evaluation in Higher Education as part of a special issue on the topic of teacher feedback literacy. So hopefully those papers as well will add further response to that question.
Ok, muchas gracias, Naomi. Hay una segunda pregunta que la voy a aprovechar este espacio para hacerla, y el resto la voy a dejar para la discusión final, para que estén tranquilos quienes las hicieron. Es una pregunta de Mariana Rosenblatt y dice: muchas veces existen diferencias en la percepción de feedback, o la calidad o la frecuencia de feedback, entre estudiantes y profesores. Los estudiantes creen que no reciben suficiente feedback, y los docentes, en cambio, creen que dan un feedback apropiado. ¿Habrá alguna estrategia o una forma de que se alineen mejor estas dos perspectivas para que todos piensen que se da un feedback adecuado?
Oh yeah, such a big challenge, and I think there are some things that we can do, and it just involves talking about feedback. Again, I think the discipline-specific approach can be really valuable here, because we can talk to students about what feedback looks like in our discipline. So students who are taking an education course, for example, what does feedback look like within the discipline of education in the professional world? And how is that being mirrored within the higher education context? And I think that can then demonstrate to students that the practices that we're using are there because we're helping to prepare them for their future professional lives, or whatever discipline profession they might be going into. So having those conversations, constructing shared understandings of what feedback is and what it's going to look like, but linking that into the discipline and how we're preparing them to be able to go and work within that discipline.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Naomi, por tus respuestas. Hay varias preguntas. Si te fijas y tienes tiempo después en las próximas presentaciones y las puedes traducir al inglés y puedes empezar a contestar algunas, se agradece. Mientras tanto, vamos a seguir con la segunda ponencia y dejamos algunas preguntas para la discusión final. Entonces, vamos con nuestra segunda expositora. Muchas gracias, Naomi, nuevamente por tu participación. Vamos a presentar a la doctora Marion Heron con su ponencia titulada Conversación sobre retroalimentación, o una retroalimentación a través de la conversación. La doctora Marion Heron es responsable de supervisar y apoyar el marco de excelencia en la enseñanza de City, en la Universidad de City, así como de contribuir a los talleres y sesiones de maestría en educación superior y desarrollo profesional continuo. También imparte docencia en programas de posgrado en la Universidad de Literatura e Idiomas y supervisa estudiantes de doctorado en las áreas de lingüística aplicada. Antes de esto fue profesora titular de TESOL en el Instituto de Educación de Sheffield en la Universidad de Sheffield Hallam, enseñando módulos de pregrado y posgrado en enseñanza de inglés para hablantes de otros idiomas. Desde el 2019 al 2015 trabajó como profesora en la Universidad de SEI, Dubái, donde impartió cursos en el Departamento de Estudios de Inglés y Escritura y el Departamento de Educación. Te damos la más cordial bienvenida, Marion, y la audiencia es tuya para poder presentar.
Thank you very much, Veronica. Thank you for your lovely introduction. And in fact, it's interesting, the last two questions that came up in Naomi's session just now, because I think, or I hope, that I will be covering some of those ideas. But before I start, I just want to position myself within the field of feedback, since this is the theme of this afternoon's panel. I am a little bit of an imposter in this field, I have to admit. I have the great luxury of working with Naomi closely, and we have done a lot of projects together, and I've learned a lot about feedback. But my own background is in applied linguistics, as Veronica was just saying. And I've spent many years of my career working outside the UK and working with students who have English as a second language. And so I'm particularly interested in the role of language in learning and teaching, and specifically in classroom discourse, as that's where my research interest lies. And so I come to the field of feedback from a slightly different perspective. I'm more interested in digging deep, looking at what happens in classrooms, what goes on in the learning and the teaching, what goes on in the conversations with teachers and students and between students. And this is where I've been particularly interested in looking at how feedback takes place within these conversations in the classroom and what feedback looks like. So I think there was a question just now to Naomi about how teachers and students can recognize feedback, and that's a really good question, and it's fundamental to what I'm going to be talking about this afternoon in terms of looking at feedback talk. So just to say that I have some collaborators in this project. So Naomi, who's just been talking, another colleague of ours at Surrey called Emma Medland, Ed Pitt, who Naomi referenced a couple of times in her presentation, and then Kieran Ballou, who's at the University of Southern Queensland. So they've all been collaborators and excellent feedback colleagues in the project that I'm going to talk about this afternoon. So the outline of this presentation will first of all be looking at the nature of feedback. So we've just had an excellent introduction to many different areas around feedback and feedback literacy. So I'm just going to keep that very brief. I am going to elaborate on some of the things that Naomi talked about in terms of student and teacher feedback literacy. And in fact, I think that was a question right at the end of her presentation. So hopefully I'll be able to review that topic a little. Then we're going to look at the relational dimension in feedback. I'm going to talk about two studies, in fact. The first study was one in which Naomi, Emma, Ed and I developed what we call the feedback talk framework. And then I'm going to talk about the second study, which was a validation of this framework. And I will end with some implications and recommendations for classroom practice. So really what I'm going to do is sort of talk through the thinking behind this feedback talk framework, some of the discussions that I had with my colleagues about what the importance of classroom talk, for example, and where feedback might fit in. I'm going to talk about the two studies, but as a pragmatist and a classroom teacher myself, I'm really also interested in talking about and discussing later with some of you implications for this feedback talk framework. How can this help us with our teaching? How can this help students with their learning? So we are going to have some practical ideas as well towards the end. So looking then at the nature of feedback, we take a very contextualized approach to looking at feedback in this study, looking at feedback talk. So we need to look at the whole context of teaching and learning. And we have a really nice quote here from Karen Gravitt, where she said, feedback needs to be studied within its complex interrelations with other aspects of the learning environment. And we also need to recognize the diversity of situated feedback interactions. And that's particularly relevant when we're looking at what goes on in the classroom and the conversations and the classroom discourse in particular, because there is a huge diversity of feedback interactions. And that's exactly what we wanted to explore in our first study, and really try to understand what's happening in the classroom interaction. But what's important here is the fact that it is situated. So feedback is situated, spoken language is highly social, and therefore it needs to be studied in its particular context. For us, particularly, feedback talk is part of the dialogic interaction between students and teachers in the classroom. It is contingent on many things, but particularly the classroom talk around it. It is episodic. You have instances of feedback and you'll have instances of no feedback. And we suggest that any examination of feedback talk is situated in the classroom dialogue in its entirety. So Neil Mercer talks about the longer conversation around learning and teaching, which I think is really relevant here. So we can look at little snippets of classroom interaction, but we need to understand that this actually, the classroom interaction and the feedback talk takes place over much longer conversations than very short interactions. And also important is understanding how feedback talk impacts on the classroom interaction, and how feedback talk is part of the teaching and learning process is essential to developing teacher feedback literacy. And I'll come back to teacher feedback literacy in a minute. Another thing to point out is that we were looking at feedback talk within a particular context, and that was the seminar. So we're aware that there's many different types of teaching events in the university. Obviously there are lectures, but we decided on this particular occasion to focus on the feedback talk in seminar settings. And the reason for that really is that we felt that that was a good place to start, since seminars are generally more interactive. There tends to be more student talk. There tends to be more dialogic interaction, and also seminars are a ubiquitous part of higher education. They're really important in terms of the overall student experience, and we see them as discipline-specific small group learning events where the aim is to explore ideas. Seminars give students the opportunity to discuss, to challenge ideas with each other, and for students and teachers really to work together to co-construct understanding. So we felt that this dialogic interaction, this co-construction of understanding, would be a really rich area for us to explore feedback talk specifically. And we would also argue that feedback talk from the teacher in this particular context is a key feature of this dialogic interaction. So then a very quick look at student and teacher feedback literacies. So these are relevant when we think about developing student and teachers' understanding about what feedback actually looks like. Understanding feedback and feedback talk can support the development of feedback literacies, both for students and teachers. So starting with student feedback literacy then, is defined here by Carlos and Baud as an understanding of what feedback is and how it can be managed effectively. It's the capacities and dispositions to make productive use of feedback, and it's the appreciation of the roles of teachers and themselves in these processes. So you can see here already that an important part of student feedback literacy is understanding what feedback is and understanding how it happens and understanding what it looks like. And similarly, if we look at teacher feedback literacy, so this is David, Carlos and Naomi have defined this as the knowledge, expertise and dispositions to design feedback processes in ways which enable student uptake of feedback. And again, for that to happen, we argue teachers need to understand what feedback looks like. And in their definition of teacher feedback literacy, they identify 3 different dimensions. And these are the design dimension, which Naomi referred to just a minute ago. Design dimension is looking at how teachers structure the feedback session, for example, how they organize the feedback. The relational dimension is looking at the relationships between teachers and students and the more affective nature of feedback. And then the 3rd dimension is the pragmatic dimension, which is where teachers need to consider, for example, efficient use of time and how they can organize their feedback. So you can see already that for teacher feedback literacy to be supported, understanding feedback talk is fundamental. And particularly we were interested in the relational dimension, as dialogic interaction is highly social, and therefore the affective dimension of feedback is going to be very relevant when we consider how it plays out within the classroom discourse. So some of the issues then, which actually came up in one of the questions earlier, some of the issues that we considered when we were thinking about this project is, first of all, as somebody just mentioned, students do not always recognise feedback. Studies have found, particularly on spoken feedback, that students are not always sure when it's happening. And students and teachers may also disagree of what actually constitutes feedback. What is feedback? Students, interestingly, report that they prefer spoken feedback on assessments. They find it more useful than written comments, for example. So this was a study by Agricola, Prince and Sluijmans, who found that students preferred the spoken feedback. And it could be because in verbal feedback exchanges, it's easier for students to clarify misunderstandings and seek further elaboration on comments. In the classroom context, this is also really important, as it's feedback in time, and feedback that students can clarify, and the potential for misunderstanding is a lot smaller in a spoken feedback context. If you think about written feedback, interpretations of written feedback can vary hugely, and it's very possible that the message is not understood as intended by the teacher. So you can see already that spoken feedback does give that opportunity for dialogue, for clarifying misunderstandings, and for ensuring that both teachers and students understand what they mean. So those are some of the issues that we considered, and these really did give us the confidence and and confirmed for us why it was important to explore what spoken feedback looks like in more detail. So this is where we decided to really examine a very, very fine-grained analysis of classroom talk to see what is happening in terms of feedback. So the research questions that we set ourselves from the very beginning was, first of all, as I've said before, what does feedback talk look like? And it might seem that this is quite almost a throwaway question, but actually it's really, really important, because we keep talking about understanding feedback. But in order to do that, we need to be able to identify it. We need to be able to point to feedback talk and say, this is feedback talk. So we thought that was a really important place to start. And secondly, how can an understanding of feedback talk support teacher feedback literacy? So we were particularly interested in seeing how that would work out. So the study itself then was very much based on, we used linguistic tools to analyse classroom discourse. So there has been a lot of work done in the area of applied linguistics on classroom discourse, analysing classroom discourse. And we decided to draw on this in our study. So, for example, back in 1975, Sinclair and Coulthard at the University of Birmingham identified a common default exchange pattern in most educational settings. In fact, their work was in the school setting, but I think we would all agree that probably this represents a lot of higher education classrooms as well. So they developed this pattern called the IRF exchange, which is initiation, response, feedback. So what happens here is the teacher asks a question, for example, what is the capital of England? Students answer, that's the response, London, and the teacher says, good, and that's the feedback. So this is a very simple, and I know that classroom interaction is a lot more complex than this, but I think you can see that can cover a lot of the interaction that I've certainly seen in higher education context, not just in a lecture context, but in seminars as well. So that is the basic classroom discourse pattern. But building on that work, Jan Hardman in 2016 carried out an analysis of classroom talk in higher education context, and her work was in an accounting and business class, and she developed the feedback or the F move in the exchange above there. So whereas Sinclair and Coulthard really only identified feedback as being quite a small number of different moves, such as correct or accepting students' response or correcting students' response. Hardman went a lot further and looked at different variations of the F move or the feedback move. And she found that in this particular accounting higher education seminar, that the teacher did a lot more than just say correct or good or correct the student. They elaborated on the student's response, for example. They commented on the student's response. They acknowledged the student's response. So we can already see that there's a variety of different ways in which the teacher might be giving feedback to the student in a spoken feedback context. So we thought this would be useful for our own study, and we initially started off by looking at the F move with respect to Hardman's analysis. So what did the study look like then, the first study? So what we did was we took transcripts from 6 one-hour seminar classes, and these were across a range of disciplines. So we had accounting, liberal arts, sociology, TESOL, so that's teaching English to speakers of other languages, tourism and business, and then health psychology. The seminars were a mix of undergraduate and postgraduate students. They were also a mix of home and international students. And across the 6 teachers, there was quite a variety of experience. So there were some teachers who'd only be teaching for a few months, and there were some teachers who had 25 plus years experience. So these seminars were, as I said, were transcribed, and then we, as a group of researchers, we coded one seminar transcript individually with reference to Hardman's taxonomy of feedback talk. Although she doesn't call it feedback talk, she calls it the F move. But we looked at the transcripts with reference to her codes. We met, we discussed, we agreed which codes were relevant, which codes we found in the data. We then developed further codes, and then we all coded the remaining 5 seminar transcripts, and we agreed at the end. And what I'm going to show you in a minute was the final coding framework that we are calling the feedback talk framework. But it was interesting that we did find lots of different patterns across the feedback talk. And although we all came with slightly different coding, we did find very similar patterns. And what we found was that we found a total of 10 codes, and they reflected 3 overarching purposes of feedback. And I'm sure you'll recognize these when you think about your own teaching. So the first overarching purpose of feedback was providing information and validation. The second one was information giving, and the third one was questioning. So I'm going to show you the feedback talk framework now and just give you a little bit of time to look at it, and I'll just talk through it so that you can get a sense of what it was we saw in the data. So the first code we found was requesting clarification. So these are all, this is all teacher talk as part of the F move. So imagine that a student has made a response, has given a response to a question. So these are the 10 different ways that we found teachers responded to students. So the first one was requesting clarification. So that this might be, for example, where the teacher hadn't understood what the student said. So it might be sorry, or could you repeat that, or something like that. The second code we found was probing. So that's where the teacher seeks further details from either that particular student or another student in the class. So why do you think that? Or maybe opens it up to the wider class. But there's probing, it's getting the student to think more about that particular point, which in a seminar context is exactly what you would hope to be seeing. The third code we found was consolidating, and that's where teachers would repeat or play back a student's response. Perhaps they would paraphrase it slightly, but they would be confirming or consolidating the student's response, or confirming, if you like, by repetition. The fourth code we found was validating. So that's where the teacher acknowledges the student's input in some way. So, for example, by saying thank you. The fifth code was elaborating, and this is where the teacher builds on the student's response. So it might be, for example, adding some extra information, it might be giving an example, but building on what the student has said, not saying something completely different, not taking the topic in a different direction, but building on what the student has said. The sixth code we found was praising. So that's, as you can imagine it is, that's where the student says, you know, that's great, that's a really good idea, something like that. And then the next code is initiating, which is inviting others to speak, perhaps on the same topic. So rather than probing, which is asking why, this is offering or inviting other students to take part in the dialogue and add something to the student's contribution. The eighth code was correcting. So that's where perhaps the student has not provided the correct answer, or not quite the correct answer. So that's where the teacher corrects. Negating is where the teacher rejects an answer. And to be fair, we didn't find many examples of this. And the 10th code was affirming, where the teacher shows agreement with the response. So, for example, saying something like, yes, exactly. So this was our initial feedback talk framework. And I'll give you an example of what this looked like in practice. So here we have a very short transcript from a liberal arts seminar. So you see the student's response from lines 1 to 5. So that's where the student has responded to something that the teacher has asked earlier. And then in line 6, we see the teacher say excellent. So that's praise. And then the teacher builds on that and says, and how do you feel about that? So the teacher is now asking the student to give a bit more information, to perhaps think a bit more about the point that they'd made. And so here we can see that the teacher is probing the student in the green. And then we have quite a long turn by the teacher here, where the teacher is basically adding on to what the student has said. And we call this elaborating. And then again, we have the teacher going back to probing by asking, how does that make you feel about being at university? So you can see here, and then the student responds in line 12. So you can see here 3 different types of feedback, or 3 feedback moves in response to the student's point above. So you can see that there's quite a lot going on in terms of feedback. we would argue that it isn't just excellent that is the feedback. We would argue that, in fact, that feedback continues with probing, asking a further question, elaborating, building on the student's idea, and also then probing again with another question. We also looked at frequency of codes, and what we found was there's very high, for example, high number of affirmations across the data. We had a lot of consolidation across the data, and these all affirmation and consolidation speak particularly to the relational dimension of teacher feedback literacy, if you remember earlier, which is looking at the affective aspect of feedback. So you see that there was also a lot of elaboration, which we would argue is opportunities for teaching, perhaps, and probing, which is really what you want to see, as I said, in a seminar, given that the seminars, the aim of seminars, to encourage students to think critically about the topic. So you see a range there, very little validation, very little requesting clarification, some praise, but interestingly, very little correcting and negating as well. So this was frequency of codes across the data. But what we also found that the codes were not isolated speech acts. In fact, you just saw the example earlier where the teacher praises, then probes, then elaborates, then probes again. So we actually saw feedback codes in patterns. And the most prevalent patterns were those that started with affirmation. So we had some which were 2 moves, for example, affirmation and then elaboration, or affirmation consolidation. And we also had patterns of 3 moves. So, for example, affirmation, consolidation, and probing. So it's interesting to see that feedback talk is actually quite complex and involves several moves. And importantly, going back to the original point about getting students and teachers to understand what feedback looks like, you can see already that there's a lot to think about and there's a lot to explore here in terms of feedback talk. So we got to this point and we were very excited and we thought, yeah, we've got a great framework, feedback talk, but we felt it needed one further step. And this is where we decided to go ahead and validate the framework, because at this point it's based on data, but for it to really be used in the way that we wanted it to be used as a way of supporting teacher and student feedback literacy, we felt it was important that it was validated in some way. So in the next part of this talk, I'm going to talk through the validation of these 10 codes, which we did to provide an empirically sound, reliable and valid scheme for teachers and students to be able to better reflect on their feedback talk and to understand how feedback talk is built into the very fabric of the conversations and the classroom interactions. So what we did was an exploratory mixed methods sequential methodology, starting off with a quantitative online survey. And what we did for the quantitative online surveys, we used Carless and Winstone's framework for teacher feedback literacy with the 3 domains of design dimension, relational dimension, and pragmatic dimension. And we asked participants to agree or disagree with these statements, which were drawn from these dimensions. So we had 136 participants responded to the survey. So that was the first stage. The second stage was really getting the participants to engage with, sorry, not the second stage, the second part of the survey was getting participants to engage with the codes. And this is where we really were interested to see how the codes could be validated. So, for example, you can see on the screen here, this is a screenshot of the survey. So we had a transcript there, number 9, that's one transcript, which is taken from our data. This was from tourism. So you can see the teacher's got a couple of lines, and then you've got the student and then the teacher. And on the right-hand side was a drop-down menu. And what we asked teachers to do was to select from the drop-down menu which code they thought was relevant to that particular teacher line. So, for example, if we have a second from the bottom, we've got good. So respondents would click on the drop-down menu and would then be able to select praise, for example, we hoped. But it was interesting to see what happened, and it wasn't as straightforward as we thought. We also conducted interviews with 7 teachers. So 7 teachers were kind enough to record one of their classes. They then sent us the recording, we transcribed it, and then we then provided a transcript of the recording and carried out an interview with the teachers, getting them to really reflect on their feedback exchanges within the transcript and encouraging them to think about the feedback codes. So as you can see, there were some general questions. And then in question 8, we said we bring in the codes and we ask them to find examples of these codes in their transcripts and then to look at how students responded. So we wanted to see whether teachers were able to notice these codes themselves, or how they interpreted these codes, or how they interpreted the feedback talk. So the survey and the interviews we used then to validate the framework. The next part is very quantitative, and this really wasn't my section at all. It was my colleague Kieran Ballou, but he did a number of wonderful things with the quantitative data, and what came out was basically that we had to collapse some of the codes. Some of them were not really significant in the data. So I'll just talk you through the final framework that resulted from the validation. So you can see here that the pilot categories were essentially the original talk framework. The consolidating, elaborating, correcting, and negating were collapsed into one overarching category, which was informing. Participants really had difficulty in drawing distinctions between some of these codes, and therefore it was a lot more sensible and a lot more valid to actually collapse them into one overarching code, which was informing. We then, again, similarly, participants struggled to distinguish between these particular codes. So validating, praising, affirming were collapsed into one overarching code, which was confirming and validating. And then the final 3, requesting, clarification, probing, and initiating, these were collapsed into one final code of questioning. So we were able to validate the original framework based on this research, this further research. And in fact, what we have produced is a framework that is probably a lot more practical for teachers and students to use, and to be able to use for reflecting on their own practice. So I've got a couple of minutes left just to finish then with my promise of talking about the practical side of using feedback talk framework. So we think that the framework can play a significant role as a heuristic in supporting teacher and students' development of feedback literacy. As I mentioned earlier, the first step in feedback literacy is being able to understand what feedback talk looks like. And if you have the framework code, the framework, sorry, of the 3 main codes, and you can then reflect on your feedback talk and see where you are actually carrying out these different talk moves in your teaching. Also, what was interesting was that a lot of the participants talked about feedback as being part of their natural teaching and learning. And that's something that we felt instinctively from the beginning of the research anyway. If feedback talk is part of the classroom discourse, if it is part of the everyday conversations in the classroom, then it's very difficult to separate feedback from classroom talk in general. So one suggestion is to reframe feedback as part of this contingent classroom interaction. We think that the heuristic of a framework can work really well in an approach that Walsh and Mann called evidence-based reflection. So this is where teachers can reflect on their teaching, but that they use some kind of artifact, such as a framework as this, and they can therefore reflect in an evidence-based way. They can use the framework, they can look at a transcript of their classroom discourse, and they can identify when they're using these feedback moves, how they're using them, and really importantly, what are the students' responses to these? And this provides evidence for reflection rather than just reflecting perhaps on, you know, with nothing to base or to any claims on. So just to finish then, I'd like to share a quote from our original study, and this was from one of the teachers on looking at the transcript of her classroom. It was really interesting. She was asked to look at the feedback talk. She was asked to look at the codes, but what she came up with was this this comment here. She said, "I can see that if you define that conversation not in the narrow terms of feedback, but in a broader term, then all of that teaching approach could be seen as, you know, it's feedback." And I think that is of huge value. So I'd just like to finish there. Something to think about perhaps going forwards. And any questions?
Muchas gracias, Mario. Muy interesante tu presentación. Hay autores también que hablan que la enseñanza es una conversación, que es una gran forma de conversar, así que hace mucho sentido lo que planteaba ese profesor acerca del feedback como una forma de conversar con los estudiantes también. Aparecen acá algunas preguntas. Lucía Santelices pregunta respecto a el rol que cumple de alguna forma la autovaloración del propio desempeño en instancias de feedback formativo. Es decir, cómo los estudiantes se enfrentan al feedback y qué papel tendría el que ellos también, cómo valoran su propio desempeño.
Sorry, I didn't catch the first bit. How do students?
Cómo los estudiantes, el rol que tendría valorar el propio desempeño en contextos de feedback.
Right, okay, well that's interesting. There's no reason to believe that framework could not also be used for students to look at what's going on in the classroom as well. As I said, part of student feedback literacy is recognizing when feedback has happened. As I mentioned earlier, one of the motivators for this study was the fact that in the research it's reported students don't recognize when feedback is happening. They don't realize when feedback is happening, and they think that feedback is mostly on written work, when actually the classroom discourse is a rich opportunity for feedback. And so one way that students could assess and understand when feedback is happening is themselves perhaps with the teacher to either talk about this explicitly, and that's something that we would encourage, is for teachers and students to discuss that actually, you know, when we're having this seminar, when I am responding to you, when I'm either elaborating on what you're saying or if I'm asking you questions, that is a form of feedback. And I think that students would be able to be a lot more aware that that feedback is happening all the time, as you know, in the classroom interaction. So that would be one way of using the feedback talk framework to help students as well as teachers.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Marion. Y hay una segunda pregunta que habla acerca de la cultura de la retroalimentación. Entonces, dicen cómo, si hay alguna sugerencia o experiencias de investigación donde aparezcan tips de alguna forma de cómo generar una cultura en donde la retroalimentación sea una práctica constante y positiva en el ambiente educativo.
Yeah, that's a really nice question. I think Naomi Naomi alluded to that as well. It really is about open discussion, I think, with students. The more we share with students our own thinking about practices. So, for example, having done this research, I'm hyper aware now of what's happening in my own teaching, and having conversations with students about feedback, about how important it is for students to recognize that feedback is happening, and about how important it is for students to listen to each other and get feedback from each other as well. And then that's taking place in, for example, in a seminar context when students are asking and answering each other questions. So I think that the more that is talked about and the more that we share our own understandings with students, then that can create a culture where feedback is more noticed, more visible. That's the problem in spoken in classroom interaction, that the feedback is often invisible. So it's bringing it to light, really, by talking about these things and getting students' perspectives on things and asking students what they understand about feedback and spoken feedback and what they prefer as well.
Bien, y tengo una última pregunta que la hace David Nicol, y te pregunta lo siguiente, Marian. Si considera que la retroalimentación es una parte natural del proceso de enseñanza y aprendizaje, ¿por qué no incluye también la retroalimentación que los estudiantes generan al consultar un libro de texto o cualquier otro recurso mientras realizan un trabajo? Ya que también es un proceso natural que puede interactuar con la retroalimentación generada por el diálogo.
Yes, I think that the feedback that students get from their from various artifacts in the lesson is also part of feedback. I think, you know, feedback is just it's so woven into the classroom interaction and all the discussion and the dialogue that takes place in the classroom. You know, feedback is part of learning, teaching and learning talk. So yes, I think it's part of all the different activities that students are engaged in.
Perfecto. Muchas gracias, Marion. Vamos a dejar algunas del resto de las preguntas para la discusión final. Aparecen algunas preguntas en el chat de Question and Answer. Ahí quizás las puedes mirar y tratar de contestar algunas mientras presenta Celine. Muchas gracias por tu participación, muchas gracias por tu ponencia, muy interesante. Bien, entonces continuamos con nuestra tercera y última presentación. En este caso tenemos la ponencia de la doctora Celine Girardet, que nos presenta el tema la importancia de las emociones en la retroalimentación de pares. La profesora Celine Girardet es doctora en Ciencias de la Educación por la Universidad de Ginebra Actualmente trabaja en la misma universidad como profesora asistente del equipo de evaluación, regulación y diferenciación de situaciones de aprendizaje. Además, como parte de su trabajo, es editora jefe de la Review Lee, una revista científica sobre evaluación en educación, y representante académica asociada de Suiza en la red internacional IEN, International Educational Assessment Network. Le doy la bienvenida a Celine, muchas gracias por estar acá. Y le voy a pedir a Marion si puede bajar su presentación, si puede cerrar su presentación para que Celine pueda comenzar la suya. Eso, muy bien. Bien, Celine, tienes el tiempo de tu presentación.
Thank you. Thank you. You see my presentation? Yes?
Sí,
okay.
se ve perfecto.
Sí, okay, perfect. So hello, everyone. First, I really want to thank you for inviting me to give this speech. So as was just said, I'm an assistant professor in the research group ERED, directed by Professor Lucie Metier-Lopez. My first language is French, so you don't worry about my accent. So we are the research group focusing on assessment, regulation, and differentiation of learning in the Educational Science Department of the University of Geneva. And today I'm going to talk both as a teacher in higher education and as a researcher in the field of assessment in higher education. I'm going to talk about the importance of emotions in feedback and peer feedback, but I want to say I'm not a psychologist or a neurologist or anything like that. So I'm not specialized in the psychology of emotions, only in strictly from the educational sciences point of view. Yes. So the study of emotions originated in the field of psychology and progressively became important in education. Since the 2000s, extensive studies of the role of emotions in learning processes have been conducted, but further research about emotion is needed in the field of educational assessment. In any educational context, assessment creates emotions, either positive or negative. These emotions can be strong. So stress, anxiety, anger, frustration, recognition, pride, satisfaction, etc. Any one of us has experienced, I'm sure, these emotions at one time or another in a situation related to assessment. So yeah, to this day, research has been more focused on the emotions of assessees, so the persons being assessed, so for example, the students, then on the emotions of the assessors, so the person assessing, so basically the teachers or professors or tutors. And yet, assessing the work of a student or an apprentice, for example, or a PhD dissertation or a scientific article, in any of these cases, assessors are inclined to experience emotions, for example, pride, satisfaction, frustration, irritation, anger, etc. And finally, there is more research that focused on the emotions in the context of teacher feedback than in the context of peer feedback. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about the some theoretical elements, and it's mainly going to be in the context of teacher feedback and mainly going to be on the emotions of the assessees during the feedback processes. So first, about emotions of the assessees during feedback processes, I would like to put forward the distinction that has often been made between informational and effective feedback components. So research has shown that for feedback to be efficient, it should be informational, specific, and linked to precise objectives. It was also shown that affective feedback, particularly about the person, instead of, for example, the task or the way to do the task, it's not efficient and can even hurt learning. And there is like a consensus that negative affective feedback about the person is to be avoided at all costs. But then there's more debate about what happens with positive affective feedback. So the affective component of feedback was a lot researched through the concept of praise. We talked just about it earlier. So praise is used to preserve the learner's self-image and elicit positive emotions. Praise is typically not very valued in the scientific literature about feedback. For example, there were studies that shown that the technique of feedback sandwich, I'm sure you're familiar with it. It's when you give some praise and then you put in all the critics and then you give some praise at the end. And research has shown that students by now, they know that strategy. So they don't really value the praise because they know it's part of the strategy to, you know, make them digest the core of the sandwich. And praise can also be seen as a distraction from what's relevant in the feedback, because then the students can be so happy with the praise that they don't really listen to what's critical as a self-preservation mechanism too. On the other hand, there are some studies like the study by Foreman and colleagues in 2014 that showed that actually praise cannot be that harmful. They show that even if it's all alone, like congratulations, that was very good, without any informational components, that can elicit some positive emotions, and positive emotions are not necessarily bad. And they showed also that praise, when it's accompanied by an informational feedback about this praise, so you praise and you explain why it's good, then it can really generate positive emotions and favor motivation and engagement. They also show that praise about important moral values, for example, kindness, curiosity, perseverance, etc., it can favor self-efficacy and improve the regulation of learning. Then another way in which affective feedback has been studied is not through the concept of praise, but it's how it's manifested through the word choices of the assessor, whether the feedback is oral or written. So you can convey negative informational feedback, for example, but it can also be perceived as a positive affective experience depending on the word choice and the tone used. So that's for the introduction of the theory. And then I'm going to present you a little bit of fun I had building a table with some empirical studies that studied how what emotions and feelings you can feel when you receive positive or negative feedback, depending on when you expected positive feedback or expected negative feedback. So first, what happens if you expect positive feedback and you think you did good, and then you receive positive feedback? So obviously you feel happy and a confirmation of your self-perception. Then I put in a study that's really fun to read by Fong and colleagues in 2018, where they asked students to imagine situations that were not logical, where they actually felt the emotion that is contrary to the feedback received. So what kind of situation do you think you can experience a negative emotion when receiving positive feedback, and an emotion negative emotion you can feel when receiving the contrary? Well, you understood me, I'm sure. And in this case, they could feel shame in the case of cheating, because if you cheat, then you expect you do good, then you get a good feedback, but then you feel ashamed because you think you don't deserve it. Then what happens if you expect a negative feedback and receive a negative feedback? Well, you can feel guilt and embarrassment, anger towards yourself. You can feel happy if you get negative feedback, but less negative than you thought. That can happen. You can feel pleasure to agree with negative feedback. So it's good. You have good self-assessment skills. You can feel a will to use the feedback to improve. Then when you expect negative feedback but receive positive feedback, that's the best situation. You feel relieved. You feel like it's a pleasant surprise. You can eventually feel anger if the positive feedback is not accompanied by any suggestions for improvement, for example. Then you think the assessor didn't do a good job. And I had a friend that was like that, really low self-efficacy. She really thought that she was doing bad work, so she expected a negative feedback. She got a positive feedback, And she said, oh, I don't deserve it. I'm sure the teacher didn't even read my work and just said it was good because he was lazy. So that can happen. Despair can also happen if you think you don't deserve the positive feedback. And the last one, if you expect a positive feedback, you get a negative feedback. You can feel anger if you place the responsibility with the lecturer. You can feel sadness if you place the responsibility with yourself, with the learner. Also, negative surprise, disappointment, distress, sadness, anger, and pain. That's obviously the worst case scenario. If you expect positive feedback, you think you did good, but you didn't. And you can feel motivation eventually to prove the assessor wrong if you're really sure that you did a positive work, great work. So that was for the a big picture of a lot of emotions that you can feel associated with feedback. Of course, there are some tendencies, but what I wanted to show is also that we cannot really predict the large picture of different emotions that you can feel, because it's all really tailored to the specific situations of the feedback receiver and the assessor. So now some research about the emotion of assessors, so the people who assess, so teachers, for example. In the context of teacher feedback, Molloy and colleagues found that teacher can feel anxiety not to hurt students' feelings with critical feedback. Also, they can feel anxious not to be competent enough. And in the context about peer feedback, it was shown that students can feel threatened by their own lack of expertise. They can feel uncertain, insecure. They can also feel ownership and increased sense of responsibility. So that was some elements, just some elements we see in the scientific literature about emotions and feedback. And for the next part of the presentation, I'm going to present the context in which we do research with my research team, and specifically with Lucy Moutier-Lopez in our higher education context. We also think that we have to understand our research within the situation. So I'm going to take a little bit of time to explain our situation. So what we do in our university courses is what we call continuous assessment for learning. In French, it's Évaluation continue pour apprendre, which explains the acronym ECPA, Évaluation continue pour apprendre. It's designed according to different principles. The first one is that assessment, it has to be highly integrated in learning and instruction. I think all the people that talk today are really agreeing with this. I just want to say a little bit about the context of university in Switzerland. I did a little bit of my studies in an American university, and I was really surprised to get feedback from my professor on my work during the semester. Because in Switzerland, typically, we really separate instruction from assessment. And basically, we have a whole semester of lectures from the professor. And then when the semester is over, we have an examination session. So, of course, some professors do it differently, but that's the main tendency. And in our courses, together with Lucy Moutier-Lopez, we try to do it differently, and we try to integrate assessment in the learning and instruction, and the students don't have any exams in the examination session. So we all do it during the instruction. And also, we don't grade them until the end. We actually attribute some points during the semester, and at the end, it transforms into a grade. We don't do the feedback after grading. We do the feedback continuously, independently of the grade. Next principle is that assessment relies on varied methods, tools, and temporalities and spaces to tailor also the needs of the diverse students. Students have to share responsibility for assessment through self-assessment and peer assessment activities. I'm going to show you some examples later. Then assessment promotes reflexive attitudes. Assessment not intends intends to reflect students' cognitive performances, but also metacognitive, social, and affective learning outcomes. And assessment helps develop students' assessment literacy for students to become assessors of their own learning, and all of that is in favor of equipping them for the longer term, either because they're going to be students a while longer and they need those assessment skills, and also for their future job, because as you will see, most of them will be teachers. Now, of course, all that we do is based on scientific literature. Most of them are actually in the network that we are here today, but some of them also in French, because there are a lot of French researchers working around assessment and regulation of learning. So, of course, our assessment for learning scenarios is based on assessment for learning, also on authentic assessments, which means that we design assessments associated with complex situations from the real world. Also on sustainable assessment by David Baud, addressing students' present needs, but also future needs, and also assessment for learning, where assessment becomes in itself a learning objective. And it's continuously inspired by diverse authors, and we really adapt the continuous assessment for learning from 1 year to another. There are a lot of those researchers on this slide, but there are many others as well. Our perspective is that we really can't do it right the first time. We actually really think we can never do it perfectly. So with the literature, with the research, and with our own experience, we change things every time. It's like never ending, and there are still things to improve every time in this scenarios. So today, I'm going to talk about the continuous assessment for learning in a course that is called Assessment and Regulation of Learning in Teaching and Training Systems. So you will see that assessment is everywhere because it's the theme of our research studies. It's also the theme of the course. It's the discipline of the course is assessment. So we did in this course since 2018. At first, it was a one-semester course. We met once a week for an hour and a half with approximately 70 students. And now since 2020, it's a one-year course, still 1 hour and a half once a week with around 150 students. So it's a big course. Most students want to become teachers in primary school or other education-related jobs. The professor is Lucie Mathieu-Lopez, and I'm the assistant professor. And I'm going to show you 2 examples of continuous assessment for learning scenarios. The first one in 2018. And the data I'm going to present later is about this first ECPA. Then I'm showing you the one we're actually doing right now. So you can see also the evolution. So in 2018, students were in groups of 3 at first, and we gave them real pupils, real math assignments that we got from research in the field. And we gave them a task in which they had to come up with propositions to favor pupils' regulation and self-regulation while involving the pupils in self and peer assessment. So it's like an inception thing because they had to themselves design ways to involve their students in assessment, and doing so, we as professors involved them into self and peer assessment as well. So sometimes it's a little bit tricky. So when they did this first original production, then individually they had to write 3 feedbacks to 3 different groups of peers. And it was actually extensive feedback based on assessment criteria that they had from the beginning. It's something like 2/3 of a page for each feedback. So 3 times 2/3 of a page. Then when they did that, they received 9 to 10 feedbacks on their own group work, and they had to compare them and read them and anticipate the next task. And the next task is the regulation of the original production. They come back to their groups and their original work, and they regulate it with the feedback they got. And that's in 2018. And now this year, what we do is that there are a lot of more, there are more tasks because we improved it year after year. This time they're going to work on a real pupil, real French assignment, and they are in groups of 4. Then we provide them with guidelines stating how to work together efficiently, because we've seen that can help for group work. Then they do 2 feedbacks to different groups of peers. They get in return 8 feedbacks on their work. They have to fill in first a little questionnaire, but 8 times for each individual feedback they got, and they have to say how they perceived it. How was it hurtful? Was it useful, etc. And then there's a task where they individually have to compare the feedbacks they received, and we provided like an Excel table, and they had to say what they agreed on, what they disagreed on, and then do a synthesis of the 8 feedback. And then there's they come together in groups of 4, and we do what we call social moderation, which was usually a research topic among teachers when they grade together. But here we adapted it into our context, and social moderation is when students, they have to agree together in group on the regulations that they're gonna put in their original production. And then they go back and they regulate the original production. And in both cases, 2018, 2022, always we end with an individual conceptual reflexive and a reflexive assignment. We make a lot of efforts in reducing the stakes of the assessment process. There are a lot of evaluative tasks, but we award them points. But first, it's only a little bit of points, and they just get points for doing the task, following the guidelines, things like that. So because they're still learning, we start at the very beginning of the class. They haven't learned yet. So there's room for mistakes, and they know it. We explain that to them, and we give them the criteria. And as we go on with the task, there are more points awarded, and assessment criteria become more about mastering the course content towards the end. And they are saying to us that it helps with evaluative pressure that we do that. So we work a lot with assessment criteria during the whole process. So when I'm the students and I write my original production, I have the assessment criteria. Then I write my feedback on another production, a group of peers, and I have the same assessment criteria. Plus, I have to reflect on the task. Then I receive multiple feedback from peers that also assess my work according to the same criteria. Then I revise my production, always with the same criteria. And at the end, the teacher assessment also used the same criteria. So it's very transparent. There's no surprise, and they can really work with the criteria during the whole time. One example of analysis we did, and that I really like, it's actually this one on the 2019 edition of the course. So it's inspired by David Nichols' work on inner feedback that we talked about earlier, also with Naomi Winston. So I'm talking as if I'm the student. Okay, so I do the group work. When I write my feedback then on the other peers group work, automatically I compare my production, the one I'm assessing, with my own production. This generates inner feedback about my knowledge related to the content of my own production. Then I receive multiple peer feedback about my own group work. And almost automatically, I compare them. For example, I would say feedback 1 says we use the concept of retroactive regulation. It's a concept that we use. You use it accurately, but feedback 2 and feedback 3 say there are some issues in our use of this concept. So I compare what they say, and it generates inner feedback about the content of my work. But I also compare the form of the multiple feedback. For example, feedback 3 and 4 used questions to provide suggestions. And then I compare this with my own feedback, and I'm like, oh, I didn't use any questions, but I think it was great. I'll do it next time. So this comparison then generates inner feedback, but not about the content of my group work. It generates inner feedback about my own feedback writing skills. and that can make me improve my feedback literacy. Then we also gave them, and that was kind of great, we gave them the feedbacks of the peers that also assessed the same peers group work as they did. And they had to compare them also, and they compared them with their own feedback, obviously. So it generated inner feedback about their feedback writing skills, but then also about the content of the group work, because, for example, I can realize through other peers' feedback that I misunderstood a concept, and then I can regulate my own group work with this inner feedback that I constructed. So that's something we really like, because if you want students to learn, it happens in their head. So if you just think about feedback as something you provide, and you don't think of it as something that you build also in your head, in your brain, then it's hard. And thinking about feedback as something that you built in your brain, then it has a direct link with self-regulation. Now, our research showed that emotions and feelings are intertwined in how these feedback processes work, like all over. And I'm going to present a study about emotions and feelings associated with peer feedback in the 2018 edition of the Continuous Assessment for Learning scenario. So we were in 2018. There were 73 students, and they did the whole thing. So original production, writing 3 peer feedback, receiving 9 to 10 peer feedback, regulating their production. And at the end, we asked them some questions, not about emotions, but just about the gains and limits they experienced. The questions were, what have you gained from writing peer feedback? What were the limits? And same for receiving peer feedback. And they wrote a few hundred words for each question. And it was made so that the teachers, so us, we couldn't read this reflexive writing before students got their grades, to avoid serious and obvious bias, because we were the teachers. Yeah. So what we did, what I did in a study in 2021 is that I coded all the words in the students' answers that conveyed affects. So affect caring words, I say it like that. And for that, I used existing lists of feelings in French, extensive list of feelings in French, very long lists. And so that was a really hard coding. No, it was easy. It was just long. And I did that separately for feedback production and feedback reception. And I also coded the context in which the effect carrying words appeared. So their antecedent, their object, the consequences, and the timing of the feeling. And I counted the occurrences for each word. So this is not for you to read. You can't read this. It's not the point, and it's in French. And the point was just to show you that the coding resulted in like 7 pages of tables like this of feelings and contexts for the feelings. And so for the results, I distinguish between positive feelings, deactivating negative feelings, and activating negative feelings, which are concepts that were elaborated by Pekrun in 2006. So basically, there are negative feelings that deactivate you, and there are like boredom, for example, and there are some negative feelings that can activate you, like stress, for example. I felt very stressed before doing this conference today, but then it helps me perform because it activates me. So for the positive feelings, you can see that both tasks, so feedback production and feedback reception, were appreciated. Confident. They made students felt confident too. There were not so much deactivating negative feelings. Heaviness was felt with feedback production, mainly because they had to write 3 feedbacks and they said it was redundant. And hurt was felt exclusively with feedback reception. So obviously when the comments hurt their feelings. And activating negative emotions was the most things that we saw, especially in feedback production. So writing peer feedback generated a lot of feelings linked to difficulty, doubt, destabilization, anxiety. A lot also for feedback reception. although a little less, except for destabilization, that's higher. So sometimes receiving feedback increased their confidence, but sometimes it added confusion. We will see that in context just after. So yeah, first, there are some feelings that emerged from feedback production, and they were associated with the overall task. So for example, there were feelings connected to being in the shoes of a student whose work is assessed by the teachers, by the professors, because there were some points for their feedback, but not about the content of feedback, because they could make mistakes. And we didn't want to correct the feedback because we wanted them to doubt the feedback they received. So we only awarded points for the feedback skills, the feedback writing skills. So they had points if the feedback was specific to their peers' work. They had to provide suggestions for improvement, and there shouldn't be any judgment on the persons of the students that wrote the production. So students said that they felt vulnerable because their work was going to be assessed by the teacher anyway. Then being in the shoes of an assessor was also something that was actually the first time for most students when they could assess some work. And most of them were going to be teachers, so they found it, they appreciated, they felt valued, they think it was useful, they felt involved, motivated, responsible. So yeah, being an assessor for the first time was enriching and made me realize the heaviness of responsibility coming with this role. So it was heavy also. And also they thought it was very complex to be in this position because mainly the students were all at the same level. So they didn't feel legitimate to assess their peers' work. That was something that was felt a lot. And then I'm going to skip that one for time management because I'm going to talk about it later anyway. Then there were feelings associated with the assessment process. So they had to read peers' production, to understand and interpret peers' work, to assess the work, so practice their evaluative judgment, and communicate assessment. And there were feelings associated with all of these. So first, there was something that they found they appreciated, but also was the object of destabilization is that they acknowledged the diversity of proposition about the same topic, because they all had the same math case situation at the beginning, and they all had the same guidelines, and they all did different works, and they had to realize at that point, the students, that there is not one good answer, but a lot of good answers, and that was appreciated, but also destabilizing. Understand and interpret peers' work. It's what Marian said earlier, because it's written peer feedback. They had difficulty understanding, and they couldn't discuss it because it was anonymous. So that's the main difficulty about understanding and interpreting peers' work, is not understanding what they're saying in their written words. Assessing peers' work was also hard. For example, assessing the relevance of the proposition and the accuracy of contents created feelings of difficulty, destabilization, and doubt, sometimes with strong words like this quote: "It's horribly disabling to ask oneself constantly if we go too far, if we're too synthetic, and if we don't ask enough." So even if they were used to the criteria and they worked with it already a lot, assessing when the criteria is met or almost met or not met at all was difficult for them. And yeah. And then communicating assessment also can be difficult, and mainly because it was hard to find the right words to convey their message without being judgmental. They say it was very, very difficult. So mainly activating negative emotions. Now, about the feelings emerging from feedback reception. So there are feelings also that were associated with the overall task, like the fact that they're being assessed by their peers, that created feelings of difficulty, doubt, destabilization, anxiety, hindrance, for example. the student that said, reading the feedback, I could not know for sure that what the student said was accurate. Contrarily to a teacher's feedback, one cannot consider a student's feedback as the absolute truth. Then made us laugh a lot because, yeah, you know. And then with teacher feedback, I just do what they say without thinking. With peer feedback, I could argue when I didn't agree. So there's a sense of affirmation there that can happen. And I'm going to, again, skip this one because I'm going to talk about it later on. Then feelings associated with the assessment process. So again, they had first to read peers' feedback, then to understand and interpret the feedbacks. Then they had to sort out the comments, and then they had to use the feedbacks to regulate their own production. So again, they realized the very diverse variety of feedback coming from a single same assignment, and they thought it was interesting. Then it was obvious difference between the feelings when receiving positive or negative comments. So when receiving positive comments, that mainly helped with their confidence, feelings of safety towards, for example, the understanding of the concepts. And when it was negative comments, they can be more difficult. They can feel hurt, dissatisfaction, demotivation, frustration, disappointment, constraint, doubt, destabilization, anxiety, appreciation sometimes, and involvement of their peers in their work. And this quote says, when feedback questions are whole worked and I only had negative comments, it did not push me to regulate my work. It repulsed me. I didn't analyze this feedback deeply enough and might have missed relevant comments. So one of our interesting results in this study was this thing specifically, is that sometimes they just disregard the feedback when they feel hurt by it. And so the feedback is just useless because they really don't analyze it. They don't use it. They don't use it in their creation of inner feedback because it hurts them. So it's important to make sure you write feedbacks that don't avoid hurting students, even if it's really hard. Understanding and interpret peer feedback is the same as the previous one. Sort out peers' comment was a step that they really had to do, and it was appreciated, but most of all, it was difficult. They felt doubt, destabilization, constraint, and anxiety, mostly because when receiving 9 to 10 feedback, they were contradictory. So they received many feedbacks. It resulted in contradictory comments, and that's one of our purpose. So they didn't know which feedback to follow. And in this case, they had to answer this difficulty, and they had to go back to the course material to assess the validity and the accuracy of the multiple feedbacks. And that's something that was very powerful, because if we give teacher feedback, they don't do that. They just do what we ask them to do. So yeah. Now, I didn't check the time, but I think I'm okay. I have the last part, which is about the role of emotion in the regulation of learning. So the role of emotion in regulation of learning. So our studies showed that positive emotions seem to favor motivation and implication in the tasks. Deactivating negative emotions seem to discourage motivation and implication in the tasks. And activating negative emotions seem to represent a trigger for deep content learning under certain conditions. And those things are also shown in the literature. About the activating negative emotions, what happens in our studies? What happens is that when they produce feedback, they feel anxiety, doubt, destabilization created, and that creates a need that can also be felt as a constraint to go back to the course material to solve the emotional discomfort produced by the lack of expertise that they're feeling. And with feedback reception, so they get feedback, they also doubt and they get destabilized, and it pushed them to go and check the accuracy of peers' comments and push them to go back to the course material to solve which comments to follow. And these mechanisms resulted in a better understanding of the concepts according to the students. So now in the literature, it's not really, it's really shared, those findings. So it was already known. There's nothing really quite new about this study. It's just, I think it's interesting anyway. So it was shown that positive emotion increased time on task and efforts, increase interest, motivation, and involvement, decrease negative emotions, and increase academic performance. It was shown that deactivating negative emotions are harmful for motivation and involvement, that emotions stemming from assessor judgment can have a dramatic effect on learning, particularly with students with low self-efficacy. And about activating negative emotion, it was shown that it can increase extrinsic motivation for the task that can actually transform then into intrinsic motivation, that it can create a need to reduce the gap between current level and the needed level of mastery to accomplish the task, and that it can create an emotional discomfort for having that can have positive effect on learning. So the way feedback works, I tried to model the role of emotions in the regulation of learning according to the study. And we know that the way feedback works is by reducing the gap between the current and desired understanding. So the gap between where students are and where they need to be. And this gap creates an emotional discomfort, some negative activating feelings. If those are not too strong, it can be a trigger for the regulation of learning. Now, if I'm already where I need to be, then I feel good. I don't have any negative emotions. I don't need to learn in order to accomplish the task at hand. I can just do it from where I am now. And then if the gap is too big, the negative activating feelings can be too big, too strong. So the gap needs to be in this zone of proximal development. And in this case, activating negative feelings can be a trigger for the regulation of learning. And now positive feelings and negative deactivating feelings, they seem to mainly impact motivation and implication in the task, which of course are also needed for the regulation of learning. So I'm reaching the end of the presentation with this thing that we already established earlier and for a long time now, is that really feedback literacy matters. Engaging students in peer feedback and in self-assessment is a way to develop their feedback literacy as assessors and as assessees. They can be better equipped for their studies and the feedback they're going to have to process as learners. They can also be able to give constructive feedback to peers. And in our context, it's important, of course, because they have to train to become teachers who are going to work with feedback constantly. But actually, we can say that about a lot of jobs now. So a message that stems from my presentation would be that it's crucial to include the study of emotion in the development of feedback literacy, which is already something that has been said also, and that has been done. Feelings are constantly with us all the time, but assessment and feedback is a context that is particularly inclined to generate very, very powerful emotions that can be awesome, but also devastating, and that can impact learning. And I thank you for your attention. And do you have any questions?
Muchas gracias, Celine. Muy clara tu presentación, muy completa. Nos vas mostrando como el camino que han seguido en la investigación en esta área. Así que te felicito a ti y al equipo con que has estado trabajando. Hay una pregunta acá en el chat, larga, porque tiene como hartas preguntas en una. Entonces, primero es de Luz Elena Hernández. Ella te felicita por la presentación. Y ella pregunta si este estudio, donde se identificaron palabras y sentimientos asociados al proceso de evaluación, se hizo en modalidad presencial o a distancia. Esa es la primera pregunta. Y si se hizo a distancia, que es la segunda parte de la pregunta, o cuando se hacen estudios a distancia, suelen mencionar la sensación o el sentimiento de aislamiento de los estudiantes, como una emoción que se repite. ¿Tienes alguna idea sobre otras formas de abordar esto? Es decir, si la planificación de las clases y las evaluaciones en colaboración son importantes, pero ¿qué otras estrategias son posibles en un contexto de aprendizaje a distancia? Y pensando un poco en las emociones que los estudiantes tienen de sentirse aislados en este proceso.
Okay, thank you for your question, Ruth, and thank you for being here. So it was on-site, face-to-face, but when they did the sum of the task was online. So we play with that. They are face-to-face for the course, then they are face-to-face for the group work. Now in 2022, actually, they are by Zoom for the group work, but back in 2019, it was face-to-face. Then they do things individually at home and they come back. So we play with that. We don't have these things about the feeling of loneliness. I think it's because we really play with the going back and forth between individual and group work tasks, and also because it was not an all online learning. Of course, I don't know if I answered the question. Yeah.
Perfecto, gracias, Celine. Y una última pregunta que aparece acá, que voy a unir dos preguntas que aparecen. De alguna forma, las emociones son naturales y aparecen tanto emociones positivas como negativas. Quizás uno debería enseñar a los estudiantes cómo gestionar sus emociones, y no solamente al estudiante, sino también al profesor, porque muchas veces hay profesores que entregan retroalimentaciones muy negativas. ¿Cómo podemos retroalimentar al profesor para que cambie o transforme su proceso de retroalimentación para que sea más constructivo?
Yeah, thank you for the question. Yes, of course, there were actually some studies by Swiss colleagues from the University of Geneva in psychology that worked on a way to train students to receive feedback and to manage their emotions for receiving the feedbacks, and they found that it actually helped them reduce the impact of negative emotions that can be so strong sometimes. And so, yeah, that's something that we really want to, that's something that I think there are two approaches. Either you train students to give feedback that are the least hurtful possible. So you train them to really pay attention to the words they use, to really convey critical information, but not in a way that it's hurtful. Or you can train students to manage their emotion, and in the case of bad feedback, maybe, or you do both. You can do both. We didn't try in our classes to do training on emotion management because we don't have the expertise in that, but that would be so interesting. Thank you for the question.
Bien. Muchas gracias, Celine. Quiero invitar a Naomi y a Marion a sumarse al panel para contarles acerca de preguntas finales. Bien, muchas gracias. He anotado aquí algunas ideas de preguntas que son generales para las tres, ¿ya? La primera es bastante general. Si ustedes tuvieran que pensar en cuáles son las grandes debilidades o los errores comunes en la implementación de prácticas de feedback por parte de profesores a estudiantes, pero también en la implementación del feedback entre pares. Sé que Naomi dijo algo en su presentación, pero si pensamos un poco en el foco de Naomi, que tenía que ver con la literacidad de Marion, que tiene que ver con el feedback talk, ¿cierto? Y después pensamos en Celine con las emociones. ¿Cuáles son lo que podemos mejorar, lo que comúnmente no hacemos bien y que podemos mejorar en este ámbito? háganme un gesto, una señal de quién le gustaría partir. Ya, Naomi.
Yeah, I'm happy to go first. Thank you. Yeah, I think it's a really good question because it encourages us to think about the resource that we have and the way in which we use that time, our not just our time, but also our kind of emotional input into feedback processes and what impact we want them to have. I think one of the things we can do differently is think about when we use our time most productively to support student learning through feedback. Now, a lot of feedback typically happens right at the end of a module or a unit on a final assessment piece, and students will often feel then that they've moved on, and that is less useful to them. So if we're still going to do that, can we signpost to them the transfer of that feedback? And it might come a month later, it might come a year later, but show them where there is an opportunity for them to use that feedback. But more importantly, could we think about providing those feedback comments at a completely different point within the cycle? For example, halfway through the module or unit, if students submit a draft, that's when we put our time into detailed comments because they can directly use them and they can have impact. And minimizing that sort of end of module unit commentary, which is much less useful for students and therefore perhaps a waste of time for us.
Muchas gracias, Naomi. Muy aclaradora tu respuesta. Mario.
Yeah, can I just clarify the question? Were you asking about peer feedback, how peer feedback can be done better?
Sí, yo lo puse desde el lado más como de lo que no deberíamos hacer, lo que deberíamos cambiar si lo estamos haciendo, los errores comunes que ustedes han visto en su investigación que cometemos los docentes.
Yes, of course. So I will come from the sort of the language perspective again. And one of the things that I've noticed in feedback is, if I think about written feedback for a moment, is actually Celine just referred to this as well. It's the way that teachers write the feedback, the words that they use to give the feedback. And sometimes this can be hurtful, as Celine has mentioned, and it can cause incredibly negative emotions such as repulsion, which I was really shocked to see in one of your quotes there. But I think teachers can certainly think about how they're writing the feedback, how they're wording it, and think about the impact of that feedback, but also how clear it is. So, for example, there's been a lot of work looking at how written feedback can be sometimes unclear. Maybe the teacher mitigates it too much, so too many, oh, maybe, possibly, you could do this, to the point where the message is not clear and students are not able to interpret that feedback correctly. So I think there's a lot of work to be done around written feedback and the language that is used in written feedback. So that would be my thing to consider for the future.
Yeah. And yeah, my thing that I had time to think about it now. The thing I thought about is that sometimes I see people that try to do to put into place peer feedback, and they just put the students together and they say, okay, now you assess each other's work. And I think that is a mistake, because you cannot expect students to know how to assess. Assessment is really hard, and you have to really create conditions for peer feedback to work and train students to assess, train them to use assessment criteria. They have to understand what it is. They have to know what they have to assess and how they have to assess it. And I think it's crucial that point you have to train students to do it. They cannot just do it themselves correctly, magically.
Muchas gracias por su respuesta. Nos dan luces de cómo podemos ir mejorando. había otra pregunta que creo que puede también ser contestada por todos y podemos unirla a otra, ¿ya? Entonces van a ser como dos partes de una pregunta. La primera es, ¿qué pasa con los cursos numerosos? Hay prácticas de feedback que son mejores para cursos numerosos. En Chile muchas veces tenemos cursos grandes. Y por otra parte, si es la misma retroalimentación o las dimensiones de la retroalimentación o las características de la retroalimentación debería ser similar para estudiantes de cursos iniciales, como de primer y segundo año, aquellos que ingresan a la universidad, a diferencia, por ejemplo, de la que podemos entregar a los alumnos que ya están en los últimos años o están prontos a egresar. ¿Debería haber algo distinto en el feedback que se entrega o no necesariamente? Celine.
Yes, this time I tried to go first. So what happens in large courses, I can tell you some things about that, because that's our experiences in large courses, well, like 100, 150 students. Our answer to feedback in large courses is peer feedback. Because if we do peer feedback, they can each do like 2 or 3 feedbacks, and then they get like a huge amount of peer feedback. And as teachers, we don't have the time to provide individual feedback for 150 students like 8 times in a year. It's not realistic. So for us, peer feedback is the way, because it really helps them get multiple feedback. Also, maybe it's not as good as teacher feedback, because they don't know the material as much as we do, but then we think it's a strength, because they know that the feedback is questionable, so they have to work with the feedback and not just take it for granted. And about the characteristics for first year, the one that I showed you was in a 3rd year of bachelor class, and now we do it for the first year students. And we do the same, because we think that assessment skills are the same. We have the same objectives for all of the students about this. And also in our context, not a lot of teachers do it. So I think we are one of the only groups of people I know actually that do that training. So students didn't have any content about that. So we do it the same.
Perdón, Mario.
Yes, thank you. Gosh, really good practical question there. I'll just jump to the second one. First of all, about whether feedback should be similar or different for first years and final years. My experience of first year students is they probably need a lot more support and scaffolding in terms of the feedback that they get. Feedback can be incredibly overwhelming when they've first started off. So in my experience, obviously it depends on the rubric, it depends on the assessment criteria that you're using, but I think the criteria need to be really student-facing, student-friendly language in the assessment criteria. It's really important, and to do all the things that Celine has just talked about, encouraging the use of assessment criteria rubrics right from day 1 of class, so that they're completely transparent, and encouraging students to use the criteria for self-evaluation, for example, but also the importance of when, like Naomi said, drafting I think is really important for first year students, so that they get the opportunity for feedback using the criteria. And then my final thing for first year students would be that perhaps the teacher could focus on a couple of key things that they want the students to develop for future work. So there may be many things that the student needs to work on, but it's just too much in one go. So I think it's sort of judicious use of particular points for students to work on. I think that's particularly important in the first year, and then perhaps by the final year students are able to manage the feedback more holistically perhaps, and one would hope by this stage that they have a bit more experience of feedback, and they have some feedback literacy themselves by then.
Yeah, so I agree with everything Celine and Marion had said. I think the large classes one is a question that comes up time and time again, and it is the big challenge, I think. And I think it's also important to reflect upon that what constitutes a large class really does differ by discipline, by national context as well. But one way in which this works, and this doesn't happen in every situation, is if there are a good team about working on a module or a unit. So I'm thinking of the work of Jacqueline Broadbent from Deakin University in Australia, and she's published a paper about regular audio feedback at scale, 1,500 students in a class, and they all get regular audio feedback on their work because she's got a team of markers that she can train to provide the audio feedback. That's not always a luxury that some teachers have. So what can we do then when we have a large class? Well, I think we need to make better use then of cohort level feedback, so that the kind of feedback that we can provide to a whole class about what was done well, what were the common mistakes on an assessment, and how to improve things. Now, students often complain about this type of feedback because they don't feel it's individualized and it's not personalized to them. So what we can do then is activities with our students to do that next step, to translate the generic cohort level feedback into something that does mean something to them. And there's an activity in our feedback toolkit actually that is designed to do this, to enable students to reflect upon cohort level feedback, to compare it against their work, and to think about which bits apply to them and what they can learn from how the class as a whole have done. And I think that again links really nicely to David Nichols' work about inner feedback and making comparisons, because that is encouraging students to do that directly and apply it to their own work. I've also seen feedback webinars work really well with large classes. So similar kind of idea, general feedback, but then opportunities for questions and answers about the feedback, about the assessment. And it's quite an inclusive practice because all students get to hear all of the responses rather than those being hidden and only heard by some students.
Bien, muchas gracias a las tres por esas respuestas. Y tengo una última pregunta, general también, voy a aprovechar de hacérsela a las tres, y que tiene que ver con el contexto chileno. En Chile la evaluación en general es sumativa. En general estamos todavía priorizando pruebas escritas que ocurren 2 o 3 veces en un semestre y que tienen gran ponderación. Y la retroalimentación normalmente es al final, ¿ya? Es decir, ese es el escenario, es decir, una vez que se entrega la prueba con ya su evaluación, con su calificación, la retroalimentación, esa es la tendencia. Hay diferencias, evidentemente, hay personas que se salen de este molde y lo hacen mejor, pero esa es la tendencia. ¿Cómo nosotros podemos favorecer, y hace sentido que el feedback sea antes de la evaluación, por ejemplo, a través de trabajo, exemplars, ¿cierto? Con desempeños de estudiantes de años anteriores y poder analizarlos, por ejemplos de preguntas de prueba o de trabajos de años anteriores? Eso resulta como más claro. Pero la pregunta es cómo también podemos favorecer el feedback durante la evaluación. ¿Qué prácticas uno puede promover para entregar feedback durante el proceso de evaluación, cuando especialmente en este contexto que son pruebas escritas? Y en ese sentido, un poco uniendo al trabajo de Marion, cuando hace estos códigos de análisis del feedback talk, ¿en qué momento de ese feedback talk aparece lo que podríamos decir el sentido como compartido entre el profesor y el estudiante? ¿Cuándo el alumno le hace sentido lo que el profesor está diciendo? Es decir, aparece como el insight o el aprendizaje. Si de repente se pudiera profundizar en eso. Sí, Mario.
Well, I can certainly talk I'll talk about the question there about the feedback talk. I think that's a really good point about when does the teacher realize that actually, that learning is taking place. And I think that's got a lot to do with that dialogic interaction between teacher and students, and between students themselves as well. So it's a lot about probing students further, getting them to really explain their thoughts, lots of why questions in a classroom context, and asking students to give evidence for their ideas. For example, what support can they use in making those claims? So that's where in the feedback talk, I think that's where the teacher can really understand whether students have learned something or whether they understand something. So lots of probing and questioning as one of the codes that we had in our feedback talk. And then students can do that with each other. So in a peer feedback context, for example, there's no reason why students can't ask and answer questions with each other and you know, encourage each other to think a bit more deeply about a topic. In terms of the point you were making, how can feedback happen during learning as opposed to just the summative point at the end? Something that I find really helpful with large groups as well is getting students to self-assess a lot more before the final assessment. So using whatever criteria or rubric that you have for your final assessment, asking students to use this for self-assessment, self-evaluation, and also using exemplars perhaps of good student work, and asking students to have that, you know, inner feedback experience where they look at what the teacher considers a good answer or a good essay, or an essay that got a certain grade, and asking students to compare their own work with that. So that's one way perhaps of allowing or giving students the opportunity for some sort of feedback before the final assessed feedback.
Gracias. Celine.
Yes, I'm not going to be long. I just wanted to say that I think we all agree that students need to learn, to be given the opportunity to learn before being tested and graded. It's like one of our purpose. And as we also agree that feedback is one of the most effective way to help students learn, as like a lot of studies have shown, like Hattie and Timperley 2007 show that feedback is one of the most powerful way to help to promote learning. Then if we put those two things together, feedback has to be moved before the grade, because after the grade, then the student is already tested and it's over. It's like, I'm finished learning, I have my grade, I know what I'm worth. So I just wanted to say that I think it's something important that we have to change, maybe, is to really consider feedback as something that has to happen before the grade in any context. I don't know if it's the same in your context, but in our context, when you give feedback after the grade, students, they just listen to you and then they just throw it away and they don't do anything about it anyway.
Yeah, I think Marion has made a really important point, which is about the pre-task activities and guidance as feedback, those processes of engaging with exemplars and so on, acting as feedback. But maybe I'll add one extra thing, which is about what students then do with the feedback on those summative evaluations, on those written tests, and how that can be more useful, which again follows up directly from what Celine has said about that feedback being useful. So we've done research around students' memory for feedback, how much they remember from written feedback and what types of feedback they remember. Now, in general, we find that students on average, it's around 17% of feedback that they actually remember after a very short delay. So what that indicates is that it's no use just giving students feedback and expecting that to stay with them and have an impact. We need to have opportunities for students to work with that feedback and to really internalize it and make sense of it, so that they're then more likely to draw upon it in the future. So using the time once feedback has been returned for them maybe to redraft a section or have another go at something, or do something that implements that feedback. In that research on memory for feedback, we've also found that students are more likely to remember feedback that's at the process level rather than the task level. And Celine mentioned John Hattie's work. And so if we're providing feedback on a summative test, trying to provide comments that are much more about how they went about completing the task rather than the actual task itself seems to be more memorable for students, because it can be transferred and it can be used when they complete the next one of those tasks. So I think there are some things we can do in terms of how we provide comments on a summative evaluation and how we enable students to make sense of them, that even with that kind of design should improve students' capacity to use the feedback.
Bien, muchas gracias por sus respuestas, fueron bastante iluminadoras para los profesores y para ir mejorando y haciéndonos cargo un poco del proceso de enseñanza-aprendizaje y de cómo hacernos cargo de estos temas que sin duda ocurren. El feedback, también los estudiantes tienen su capacidad de ir tomando información del entorno y haciendo su propio proceso, pero también evidentemente los profesores hacemos cosas para que eso ocurra a veces de mejor forma o más intencionadamente. Voy a dar por finalizado este panel. Quiero agradecer a cada una de las panelistas, que en este caso fue un panel femenino. Quiero agradecer a las 3 investigadoras que nos acompañaron hoy día y también a todos los participantes de este segundo panel del tercer Encuentro Internacional Virtual en Educación Superior. Aprovecho un mensaje que nos envía por el Question and Answer David Nichols, que nos dice que hay un artículo que habla de cómo entregar feedback o cómo desarrollar el proceso de feedback entre pares, de Susan McCallum, que va a estar mañana con nosotros. Entonces aprovecho inmediatamente, aparece ahí el link de donde van a encontrar ese paper de David Nichols y Susan McCallum, y que se llama Make Internal Feedback Explicit, y eso probablemente nos va a ayudar mucho a participar en el panel 3, que es mañana, ¿cierto? Que se llama Activando la retroalimentación interna, desarrollando la capacidad de autorregulación de los estudiantes. Este panel 3 lo tenemos mañana a las 9 de la mañana y esperamos contar con todos ustedes. Así que muchas gracias y nos vemos mañana. Chao, chao, que estén muy bien.